Boa tarde. Hoje nós teremos a apresentação dessa palestra intitulada Who is Winning the War in Ukraine? Facts on the Ground versus Media Framing, com Daniel Epstein. Eu vou fazer uma pequena apresentação e depois passaria a palavra. Em primeiro lugar, gostaria de agradecer ao Daniel por estar aqui conosco hoje. É muito bom ter essa circulação de acadêmicos pela nossa universidade. Fico muito feliz que você tenha tido a oportunidade de vir até aqui à USP hoje. Bom, Daniel Epstein completou o PhD em 2008 no Departamento de Governo de Harvard e em 2010 ele foi Fulbright Scholar and Visiting Professor na Bryansk State University da Rússia. Ele tem inúmeros artigos sobre a região do conflito. Vocês podem consultar o currículo dele. E pelo que eu vi na sua página, você foi assistente de campanha presidencial de Bernie Sanders em 2016. Bom, eu não vou me demorar nessa apresentação, já passo a palavra para o Dan, espero que você fique à vontade. Muito obrigada mais uma vez, Dan. Acho que você pensa.
Okay. Muito obrigado. Eu vou falar em inglês, porque meu português não é muito forte. Mas eu quero agradecer à Universidade e a Unice e também, como eu entendo, Bruno Gomide, que me invitou, e também um histórico do UFERJ, Camilo Caminhões, que está agora visitante no Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies em Harvard. Então, como expliquei, eu agora vou falar em inglês para minha apresentação, mas se tiver perguntas, eu estou muito feliz ouvir perguntas em português. Thank you. So, my presentation about who is winning the war in Ukraine, facts on the ground versus media framing, really is about the American media, which I have been observing for, several decades now, but in general, since the beginning of the full-scale invasion in Ukraine in 2022. And one thing I want to begin by saying is that having studied many other topics, for example, the development of political parties here in Brazil, which I made a study of some 20 years ago, politics and elections in Russia, Eastern Europe, the study of the war in Ukraine is become very fraught in normative terms. It becomes challenging to be able to discuss the war in sort of empirical social science terms because so many observations about the war seem to be partisan for one side or the other. So rather than trying to pretend to be completely indifferent, I will simply come out and say that my position is that I really hope that Ukraine will win this war and that Ukraine will be a free and sovereign country over all of its territory. And really it was from that position that inspired my questioning of American media framing of the war. Because as I began to view the American media and read in the American media about the war, it seemed like more and more the sensibility of the reporting in the American media made it seem like Russia is winning this war. But having visited Ukraine already 3 times since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, having followed really the details of the war from research reports as well as in the media, the sensibility of Russia seeming to be winning that is drawn out on the surface level of the American media does not align with what actually is happening from facts on the ground. So this is what inspired me to try and think about this disconnect, which to me was a puzzle. So first of all, where are we? We can see on the map here, this is from the Institute for the Study of War, which has been, this is actually from the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, this Swiss site that has a really wonderful map that changes day by day as new news reports come in. We can see all of Ukraine here. Hopefully you can see. We can see this, these red with the black surrounding parts. Those are the territories that were controlled by Russia already from 2014. The red territories are the territories that as of, well, now about a week ago, had been occupied by Russia. There's also a little bit there in Kursk Oblast, which is was occupied by Ukraine and now is, retaken by Russia. And the blue areas are the major areas that the Ukrainians have liberated after Russia initially invaded them. So if we think about these big areas, and we can see here Kyiv, these were saved from Russian invasion in the first several months of the war, these blue areas. But still Russia controls about 22% of Ukraine. So this is a snapshot of the status of the war. Russia took some territory, lost some territory. Ukraine took this little bit of territory in Kursk, and then Russia reoccupied it. So this is a snapshot of where we are on the map. But if we look at U.S. media, this is just from the beginning of November, we see, and these are 4 different media outlets. The 2 on the left are from cable news, Fox News, which is known to be more on the right, we can say, in the American TV media spectrum. And then below it, CNN, which is certainly seen to be at least very critical of President Trump, perhaps more on the left. And then these 2 from really probably the 2 most prominent newspapers, Washington Post and New York Times. And we can see that actually the Fox News headline, Ukraine strikes take out power in 2 Russian cities. Putin has dug a deep hole. This gives a sensibility of Russia being in trouble, of Ukraine maybe having some advantage. But all the other 3, Russian forces poised to finally capture Pokrovsk. Pokrovsk set to fall. Russian bombardment causes large power outages in Ukraine's big cities. These other 3 really characterize how the American media has been framing this war for the last 2 or 3 years. That the damages to Russia is to Ukraine. Russia is the one inflicting pain and damage, and giving the sensibility that Ukraine is in trouble rather than Russia being in trouble. And I will describe later the quantitative study I made to try and determine whether, at least in a given period, this sensibility that I had seems to be borne out by some data about the American media. But first, if we look at this snapshot of who's winning in early November, let's compare this with what things are like in Ukraine. So I took this picture myself in Odessa in May. We can see there's some skaters here around this statue of Alexander Pushkin, one of actually a very small number in Ukraine that have not been pulled down recently, as there has been a Ukrainian campaign to reduce or eliminate the Russian writer Pushkin from public spaces. In Odessa, though, we can see it's still here. We can see the Ukrainian flag here on this museum. This is near the famous Odessa Steps. And indeed, on a Saturday in May, when I was in Odessa, walking around, there were people skateboarding, people at the beach, listening to music. It did not look like a country that was on the verge of collapse, losing a war. Certainly, there were, especially in Odessa, several buildings I saw that had been bombed, that were fallen down partially. But it didn't look like the war was being lost by Ukraine. In fact, maybe skaters and Pushkin were winning the war, at least in Odessa at this point. And if we look indeed and follow the kind of trajectory of the war in terms of the over time, we can see at the very beginning of the full-scale invasion, Russian troops coming in from Crimea in the south, from the east, from the northeast, coming towards Kyiv. This is at the very beginning of the war. By March, many Russian troops had occupied lots of territory, were pushing very fast towards Kyiv. This was really the high water mark of the Russian forces' capacity to invade Ukraine just 1 month in. After this, the Ukrainians began to push back. We can see already by April 2022, Kyiv was saved. The Russians were pushed back from all of these areas that are blue on this map. And indeed, by October of 2022, the Ukrainian counterattack had pushed Russian forces out of this entire northern area, pushed them further back in the east and south of the country. And indeed, if we look very carefully at this map here, from now just about 3 years ago, and then from 1 year ago, we can see very little difference. In fact, if we look closely, we can see that there is a little more space here in Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts that the Russians had taken by October of last year. And this is the point when the Russian forces reached the city of Pokrovsk, which has been in the news so much recently, and really began their siege of Pokrovsk now over 1 year ago. Now, if we again fast forward from 1 year or 13 months ago to now, we can see in the last 13 months, very little progress. We'll go back and forth. You can see again, a little more area has been taken here south, but this is not really a great success for the Russian army. If we look at other ways to consider the progress of the Russian military, who is winning this war, we can see again this quantification of territorial gains and losses by the Russian army, the percentage of Ukraine's territory that it exerts control over. We can see the initial invasion, it got up to about 40,000 or 60,000 square kilometers, or I'm sorry, that's more than square miles, and then dropped down when the Ukrainians counterattacked. And then since the fall of 2022, the Russians have been making some gains, but they're hardly dramatic. They're hardly Russia winning the war, which is what, as I've said, it feels like is the media framing. Other measures of the fortunes of war, we can look at military casualties. Russia, obviously a much bigger country with a bigger population, has also lost a lot more casualties. Estimates from April, the last time that I could find estimates from advanced researchers of Russian casualties, showed them at almost 800,000, with probably as many as 200 to 250,000 killed out of this number. By now, most researchers estimate the Russians have lost casualties of injured or killed of at least 1 million. Keep in mind, April 2025, that's already 7 months ago. And indeed, the number of Russian casualties estimated over the summer per square kilometer that Russian forces have advanced in occupying, we can see in May it was as high as 71 casualties per square kilometer that the Russian military suffered. By June, 70. In July, up to 75 for each square kilometer. In August, declining to 68. This is still an enormous rate of casualties for very slow advance of the military. Ukrainians' estimates, which the Ukrainian government, like the Russian government, was not going to share actual data, but best research estimates are that as of January, 400,000 Ukrainians had been killed or injured. Military equipment lost. Again, all of these things, civilians killed is one where we see a huge disparity between over 14,000 Ukrainian civilians killed as Russian strikes are targeting Ukrainian civilian targets to a very large degree. Ukrainian strikes have either been unsuccessful or have not planned to target Russian civilian targets, and so many fewer Russian civilians have died than Ukrainian civilians. Again, this definitely makes it look like Ukraine is suffering. But is it losing the war? Here's where we begin to think about these issues of this war that is really, by now, a war of attrition. But how can it be framed for a news audience, for news organizations? Indeed, if we look at this war of attrition from January 2024 to June 2025, 18 months, Russian gains of Ukrainian territory accounted for about 1% of all Ukrainian territory. If we look at comparisons, for example, with World War I, a famous war of attrition where very little happened, when the British and French were conducting an offensive on the Somme River in 1917, their troops were advancing about 80 meters per day. Very little. It was practically trench warfare. If we look at Russians on the Kharkiv front in northeastern Ukraine, they're moving even slower than that, 50 meters a day. On the Donetsk front, in the area now of Pokrovsk, they're moving a little faster, 135 meters a day, faster than the British and the French on the Somme, but still very slow. At this rate, they would be, Shagala Prevista in Kiev of the Russian army in something like 2037, if they keep advancing at the faster rate of 135 meters per day. This is not what winning a war looks like. Indeed, if we look at these famous sieges over the course of this war, very early in the war, a city in southeastern Ukraine, Mariupol, had a famous siege. It lasted 3 months before the Ukrainian defenders were finally overwhelmed and the Russians took over the city of Mariupol. More recently, in 2024, the city of Bakhmut, just a little ways east of Pokrovsk, which is the center of the battle now, it took 9 months of siege for Russians to push Ukrainians out of Bakhmut. And now Pokrovsk is already on 13 months, and although there has been reporting all during the course of the summer, as well as the fall, that Pokrovsk is about to fall to Russian forces, even today, this morning, still the Ukrainians defend some portion of this city of Pokrovsk and still have some connections. If we think of the speed at which Russia is advancing, and Pokrovsk, this is a city it's not unimportant. Some 60,000 Ukrainians lived there before the war, but it's the 76th largest city in Ukraine. This is not a major center for all of Ukraine. Again, this is not what winning a war looks like. Now, the Russians and Ukrainians have some experience back in history with what winning a war looks like over time. So let's compare the Soviet experience in World War II. Obviously, the beginning of World War II, we see Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union. The very beginning of the war was a huge loss for the Soviet forces as German forces pushed over millions of square miles of the Soviet Union. And by the turning point of this war, the Battle of Stalingrad perhaps can be seen as a turning point on the Eastern Front. We see these huge swaths of territory that the Soviet military had lost control of by November 1942. This is a little more than a year and a half, almost a year and a half into the Soviet experience of World War II. And then beginning at this point in November of 1942, the Soviets counterattack. They begin by an attack surrounding this little German army here in front of Stalingrad. And then, over the course of a few months, in about 4 months' time, by February of 1943, the Soviet army has taken back these huge swaths of territory. By August of 1944, 21 months after Stalingrad, already the Soviets had taken back pretty much all of these millions of square miles of territory that the German army had invaded. Let's compare again. Today in Ukraine, Russia has been fighting in Ukraine for about 44 or 45 months. The entirety of the Russian or Soviet experience of World War II was 46 months. So soon, the length of Russia's war in Ukraine will be longer than the Soviet experience of World War II, an experience that began with a year and a half of losses and then turned the tide in less time, about half the time that Russia has made this small progress advancing on Ukraine. So, how to then compare and quantify my feeling or impression that the American media has been showing this war as if Russia's winning? Well, this is relatively low tech in terms of my quantitative methods. And I have used the New York Times and Washington Post, these two major news outlets, newspapers, the two most prominent newspapers. I could have used one or the other, but I figured it's a little bit more variation by considering both together. And I used a Google search to find for either Ukraine search or Russia search, searching this term, just within the entire month of October, from October 1st to October 31st of this year. So just recently, all the articles that were about Ukraine or Russia that came up on this Google search. And then, since my interest is not in what are the actual details, but what is the impression being created in the media, I just looked at the headlines. I found 80 headlines, 46 in the New York Times, 34 in the Washington Post, and I coded them just from the headline to see if you only read this headline, what would the implication be of who is pressing their advantage in the war? As we say in Russian, kto kavo, who is doing it to whom? Who has some advantage? And if there's anything in the headline that gives a sensibility of who's winning, who has advantage. I also coded them in normative terms. Which side, Russian or Ukrainian, seems to be shown to be morally in the right or morally in the wrong by doing something bad to people in the other country. So civilian targets, people who are civilian suffering, being killed. These are the kinds of things that I coded as having a normative slant, that one side or the other was doing something bad to the other. You can see that in terms of the advantage, 42 out of the 80 headlines, 53%, gave the impression of Russia having an advantage. Less than half, 23%, gave the impression of Ukraine having the empirical advantage. The Washington Post headlines were a little more showing Russian advantage than the New York Times, but they were both certainly far ahead of the percentage of Ukraine advantage. You can see that my totals do not add up to 100% because there are several headlines where it just says something happened, but there's no clear implication of which side has the advantage over the other. Similarly, for the normative implications, which side is in the right or in the wrong. And we can see the overall frame shows sympathy with the Ukrainians. The Ukrainian side is shown to be more in normative sympathy, but the Russians are shown to be, at least within the implication of headlines, winning the war. Now, why look just at headlines? Not because I want to know what the media is really saying, but I want to know what is the impression being created in the American public, as well as amongst the political class of the United States. Certainly the people making the major decisions in the United States now, at the top of our presidential administration in the United States, they evince the kind of attention span, the kind of attention to detail that really does not seem to probably go much deeper than the headlines. As we know, there is one major decision maker in the United States government now. He does not seem like the kind of person who's going to read the whole article. And so the impression in the headlines is important for this particular reason, as well as to think about what about the American public. Who do they think is winning? So why does this matter? Well, we can think about the impression of who's winning in terms of censorship, morale, and allies that each of the belligerents want to cultivate. Obviously, both sides are limiting information in part to try and keep domestic morale up, to keep Putin to keep the Russian population, Zelensky to keep the Ukrainian population from despairing, keeping them supporting the war. But also there is a particular importance in impressing allies, impressing potential other states that might support Russia on the one side or Ukraine on the other side. Potential allies will be less interested to support a state that seems to be losing. If it's a lost cause, why should we send our money and war materials or even soldiers to be lost if it's already losing? Another reason that we can think about this is we can think about media theories that might explain this disparity between the sensibility of Russia having the advantage and the facts on the ground that show a stalemate. So one of these media theories really is derived from the change in the media to a 24-hour news cycle in the United States. This started in the United States in the 1990s. I'm sure we find it in Brazil, Argentina, all over the world as well. And how does this need for news to be producing something new, something to show on TV 24 hours a day, particularly then interact with someone like Donald Trump in the United States? Because again, I'm looking at the American news media framing. We can also think of theories about journalistic standards. What is news? What is of import? What is worthwhile? What is something that the other media outlets aren't showing that we can get ahead? There is a supply and demand aspect of this. And then there are also the journalistic standards about war reporting, which for many years, for dozens or hundreds of years, one of the central aspects for journalists, if on a professional level they are not seeking to actually participate in influencing who will win the war, the focus on the humanitarian tragedy of war is of high importance to journalists. We can also think from a theoretical perspective about international relations theory and what may be a broader shift going on, starting really at the level of state interactions from a liberalism that looks to see who is right and wrong, what are the opportunities for cooperation, what are the ways to reduce harm and increase cooperation and reduce conflict, to, in the world generally, more of a focus or a return to realism, a focus on conflict, on gaining advantage, on pushing one's own state to the top. And indeed, this may be spreading beyond theories of international relations, really to the appreciation of publics in the United States, and not only the United States, as liberal democratic values seem to be in decline in some parts of the world, and strong men who are not necessarily sympathetic, are not necessarily concerned with being ethical or normatively in the right, gaining more power and also more admiration, even if what they do is seen as brutal or morally wrong. So, what are some hypotheses to explain this puzzle of the disconnect between Russia winning the war, or looking like it's winning, in the news, and the ground game, which shows a stalemate? So first we see the idea of the Trump factor. This was my hypothesis. Since I'm looking at news in the era of the second Trump presidency, in the entire month of October 2025. We know there are stories of Trump and Putin having supposedly a close friendship, certainly during Trump's first term in office. Trump has had some very negative interactions with Ukrainian President Zelensky when he first returned to office at the beginning of this year. And so this is one hypothesis. Maybe because Trump is giving the advantage to Russia, because many of the headlines in American press mention Donald Trump and his participation or suggestion of negotiations in the war, maybe because of his sympathy with Putin, more of these headlines look like they show Russian advantage than Ukrainian advantage. Now, an optimal research design would try and compare some period in the Trump presidency with some period in the Biden presidency, so we could see when there is someone who is not known to be sympathetic to Putin, if there was a difference. There are problems with this, though, because the state of what's going on in the war in different eras may be very difficult to compare. Also, I did not have the time and resources to do a much larger statistical comparison. But even within this period when I could compare, I coded each headline not just according to which country was implied to have an advantage, but also to certain aspects of what the headlines were about. Which ones mentioned Trump? In fact, it was almost half of the headlines where Trump was mentioned in the headline, 37 out of 80 headlines. But the ones that seemed to give an impression of Russia having the advantage, 51%, versus the ones that seemed to give the impression of Ukraine having the advantage, 24%, were not any more slanted towards Russia than the overall sample. So there was no difference. So there was no way that this was actually pushing the sample more towards a sense of Russia having the advantage. It's almost the same percentage as the overall sample. And indeed, especially during the month of October, Trump, as he is famous for doing, went back and forth between sometimes saying things like Ukraine should be cut up. Certainly, if that were to happen, this would be a Russian advantage. And then other times saying we're going to have more stronger sanctions against Russia. If this really happened, this would give Ukraine an advantage. So at least during this month of October, it seems like it was going back and forth, and a disproportionate Trump portion of the headlines is not responsible for a heavy bias towards Russia seeming to have the advantage. Another hypothesis, like I say, has to do with a journalistic approach to what is news. Now, like I said before, in war correspondency, human tragedy and human suffering has long had a major role. But what else are people talking about? What else is news? Certainly in this war, with Ukraine and Russia facing off with new technologies, especially drone technology, but also technologies for different kinds of missiles, other technologies. Another way to characterize these news articles was whether technology was an aspect of the headline. And so 20 out of 80 articles, a quarter, had some mention of technology, some novelty, something new going on. And indeed, here we see really a disparation on the other side. Russia is described as in ways in its technology that seem advantageous in relatively fewer percentage of the total number of articles, 45% versus the overall sample of 53%. And Ukraine is much closer to parity. 35% seem to give the impression of Ukraine having an advantage versus 23% in the overall sample. Indeed, some of these interesting headlines had to do with Russian soldiers at some point surrendering to a Ukrainian robot. There were drones in the air and some kind of rolling drone on the ground that was approaching with explosives, and without a single Ukrainian soldier being anywhere near, the Russian soldiers put out a sign from their foxhole where they were dug in saying that they would surrender. This certainly was novel, and a story like that, the headline, certainly gave the impression of Ukraine having an advantage. There was another article about how the Ukrainian military has gamified drone warfare, allotting certain numbers of points to the destruction of a Russian tank, a Russian soldier, a Russian drone, in a way to try and encourage more effective destruction of Russian war material and soldiers by Ukrainian drone operators. There were also, as we see, some articles showing Russian advantage. Some of these had to do with the effectiveness of Russian drones. Many of the articles that referenced the war actually didn't have a lot to do directly with the war, but had to do with other Russian technologies that might be used against European or American allies in a scenario where other countries came into the war on the side of Ukraine against Russia. And indeed, so we see that their Russian advantage in technology is still there. The final theory having to do with tragedy. So like I said, humanitarian tragedy is a central aspect of much war reporting and is important in journalistic standards to show. This is a big element of what is news. There were 13 headlines in this sample out of 80 that referenced human tragedy, mostly strikes on civilian targets. Almost all of these had to do with Ukraine suffering. There was one article that had to do with the case of a Ukrainian boy who was at a summer camp in Ukraine. There was no real reference to damage being done, but 12 of the 13 articles made direct reference to Russia damaging Ukraine in human ways. People killed, hospitals or schools bombed, or places where people live, not just military targets. And so here, indeed, we can see that out of these 13 articles about human tragedy, the vast proportion, 92%, gave a sensibility that Russia's hurting Ukraine. And Russia hurting Ukraine can certainly create an implication that Russia is winning. There are no articles that showed Ukraine hurting Russia, focusing on human tragedy. And so here we see then this is a decent portion of what is driving this focus on, or this impression that Russia has an advantage. These articles focused on human tragedy, and certainly the journalists who are writing these articles, if anything, they evince having sympathy with Ukraine, showing Ukraine is the one that is morally in the right as it is attacked by a morally wrong Russian military. But at the same time that this sympathy can be created, this moral sympathy, it also creates, for those who don't care about sympathy, the impression of Russia damaging Ukraine and maybe having an advantage as a result. Indeed, if we think about sympathy in a moral or normative sense or an ethical sense versus strength, we can think about strength or might, and sympathy, righteousness, whose cause is righteous. When we look explicitly at those articles where Ukraine is referenced in the article as somehow deserving of normative sympathy, either they are doing what is right in defending themselves or they are suffering unjustly by being attacked, 41 out of the 80 headlines gave this sense of Ukraine being normatively in the right. And indeed, only 6 of those gave an impression that Ukraine might have some advantage in this war, mostly where Ukraine was shown defending its territory, or 15%, whereas 66% developed the impression of Russia having the advantage. So indeed, being portrayed in a morally or normatively sympathetic manner in the American press, Ukraine is also portrayed as being the receiver of damage, the one suffering more, creating an implication of maybe who is stronger. And indeed, if we think about changes in world approaches, or at least American approaches to war and to conflict, someone like Donald Trump, speaking of U.S. Senator John McCain back in 2015, shows that he has no sympathy for people he sees are losers. This idea of machismo, that it's better to win, it's better not to be captured, that makes you a hero, rather than the bravery and moral standing of suffering capture like John McCain was in the Vietnam War. Indeed, we can see this idea in this interaction in the White House when President Zelensky first visited Trump after his inauguration, where Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance, as well as some other Trump advisors who were off screen in this photo, they kind of ganged up and on Zelensky and in front of news cameras, really in a way that I think we can only surmise had been planned. They kind of ganged up to rhetorically attack him, saying, "You have no cards. You are weak." And made him look certainly weak and embarrassed. Does this mean he's in the wrong? Does this mean that he is morally wrong? By no means, but Trump doesn't seem to care. He only seems to care about who is winning and who has an advantage. So, what are the implications of my little study for future research? Well, one implication, we can think about the policy effects of impressionistic assessments. As more and more we see presidents like Trump, like Putin, who seems to place quite a lot of importance on the impression of winning, on the impression they can give to the public as they try and control narratives, we can see that journalists and journalistic standards of what's news, of what's worth reporting, of the way one should go about reporting on war, they can create these impressionistic scenarios that may undermine even the side with which journalists may morally sympathize with. We can also think about press freedom. In a country like Russia, there is practically no press freedom. There has been intense persecution, arrest, murder of many journalists. There is no ability for most international journalists, certainly from the United States, to go to Russia without being in danger. And certainly if they are in Russia, to be allowed to report in the kinds of open ways that Ukraine still allows, though indeed Ukraine does control some significant degree of access to the war. More broadly, the Ukrainian press is more free, which indeed, this makes us question whether dictatorships have this advantage built in by being willing to practice censorship, whether democracies are at a disadvantage because a free press that reports on what is journalistically seen as important is maybe going to create the impression of weakness, where a dictatorial regime will have a better ability to create an impression of strength. Now, there's also the question of whether what I have done in my research just in the month of October, is this really just a moment in time in this war? Is Russia eventually bound to run out of gas, run out of steam, and lose? And as a result, it doesn't matter what the temporary impression is. Or is this really a trajectory? Will the impression of one side winning and one side losing lead to positive feedback loops where allies want to help who seems to be winning, even if that impression does not align with facts on the ground? And by helping the side that seems to be winning, and potential allies refraining from helping the side that seems to be losing, certainly Ukraine, in this impression created by American media, will this actually become a self-fulfilling prophecy? It's not really clear. And it's difficult with such a small research sample in a short period of time to really make this, make any argument that would be beyond this. Indeed, then for future research, if I were to develop more resources and take more time to focus on a longer period, maybe take a comparative approach, looking at the press in multiple countries, more than one country, and their reporting on the war, developing machine learning to read and code many, many larger numbers of headlines rather than just the ones I could do manually. This could make for a larger N and perhaps enable for more definitive research with more conclusions. And with that, I want to say muito obrigado, and I will be happy to take any questions.
Obrigada, Dan. Dan, abriu a possibilidade de as perguntas serem feitas em português.
Sim, por favor.
Alguém gostaria de? Para aparecer.
Hello. Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. I have two questions about the situation of the war, and I wrote them in English, so I will talk in English.
That's okay.
Based on your research, why do you think Russia is having so much difficulty advancing on Ukraine? Yes.
Why don't you ask both, and then I can...
And how much do you think the corruption scandals in Ukraine could influence the receiving of more NATO funding?
So in terms of why Russia is having such difficulty advancing, I think the Russian army really is much weaker and more poorly trained and more poorly equipped than anyone expected. Certainly than Putin and his allies or his policymakers expected. After the war in the eastern part of Ukraine, in Donetsk, the war in Donetsk started. The war here in this black area, this was the area that had been already occupied by Russians, or we could say Russian separatists, since 2014. The Ukrainian army spent about 8 years becoming stronger, learning better how to fight. And during this time, it was thought that so had the Russian army been advancing. The Russian army, when it invaded Georgia in 2008, seemed to have a very easy victory. But indeed, there's a lot of corruption in the Russian army as well as poor training, a lot of really poor treatment of new recruits in the Russian army, which had apparently not been eliminated. And so the Russian army was much weaker than it was thought to be. And it also seemed to have bad information about Ukraine. There was an expectation that the Ukrainian people would treat Russians as liberators because, in Putin's understanding, and probably what had been told to him by his advisors, the Ukrainian regime was a Nazi dictatorship, and 40 million Ukrainians would be happy to have Russia rescue them from it. So there was a disconnect between this information. And then, really, we see that the Ukrainian people, they don't want to be part of Russia, that they are willing to fight. Many people signed up for the military right at the beginning, and many have been serving since then. Many of them are exhausted, and yet they are still serving. So I think this is a big part of Russia's difficulty to advance. And Russia, with each passing month, as it's losing thousands of people, thousands of soldiers who are injured, it's harder and harder to replace them. So I think this is part of what explains the increasing slowness of Russia's ability to advance on Ukraine. Even though Russia has a population 3 or 4 times the size of Ukraine, many more military vehicles and military technology, as well as natural resources. The other question of corruption in Ukraine, I think, and I guess you're wondering whether it will reduce Ukraine's ability to receive funding from other countries, from outside, from the United States and Europe. Is that yeah. Honestly, I don't think this will have a very big effect. I think someone like Trump, who for other reasons wanted to reduce support for Ukraine, he will mention corruption as a reason that he is reducing it, but really that is just his way of communicating to the American people why he is doing what he wants to do anyway. European countries, by the same token, if they have an interest to continue supporting Ukraine, which they have been, and in fact, increasing their support, even as the United States reduced support in the second Trump presidency, they will do it even if there is evidence of corruption going on. So I don't think it actually is very important to the decision makers from other countries that might support Ukraine or not. I think they will do what they want to do, and they will discuss or ignore corruption as it's convenient for their messaging to their domestic audiences. Thank you.
Mais perguntas? Oh, Vicente vai.
Thank you very much, Daniel. It was amazing. I have 3 questions. I will try to be brief. Denise knows me very well. So I think sometimes that we have to differentiate like the victory from the military and geopolitical perspective. Like, let's imagine it as the war ends today. If the war ends today, who won? I would say that Russia won because, like,
If it ends on these lines.
like what? Yes. If you look at the slides, if you, we can say that Ukraine lost several ports in Crimea and in the Black Sea and in the Azov Sea. Ukraine lost the access to the Azov Sea, lost the access to rare earths in Donbass, and is still losing more rare earths in Donbass. Ukraine lost nuclear electropowers, lost control over most part of the Dnipro River, like lost several towns like Melitopol, Mariupol, Berdiansk, Skadovska, Novokakhovka, and many other like medium towns. No? And like more than 12 million people lost their houses and thousands of people lost their lives. So I would say that in terms of military and geopolitical perspective, like Russia is winning the war. But if we look at from the political perspective, like first, we don't know what were the main like political objectives of Putin in the start of the war. But let's imagine that at least in the beginning of, at the very beginning of the war, it seemed that he wanted to conquer all over Ukraine, like to occupy all over Ukraine, maybe to annex Ukraine, maybe to set a pro-Russia president there and remove Zelensky. So from the political perspective, I would say that Ukraine is perhaps winning the war. Like in terms of language as well, like I think that before the full-scale invasion of 2022, if you look at the amount of people that are speaking Ukrainian now is much more than before the full-scale invasion. Like the national identity of Ukraine is now it's stronger. Like the Ukrainian identity nowadays is much more distant from the Russian identity. So I think that the war has shaped the Ukrainian identity and has distanced like it from the Russian identity, no? And from the Russian word, from the Ruski Mir. No? So this is my suggestion, just my opinion, that we have to differentiate like the victory from the military and geopolitical standpoint, from the political perspective. My second question is about like I've been following the Ukrainian media, like Ukrainska Pravda, for example, and the headlines are not very different from what you've shown here, not so. Can you say that the Ukrainian media is not pro-Ukraine? Like, because every day I read like the Ukrainska Pravda, and they say we lost 2 villages here, we lost another village here, and especially during the past 2 weeks, like I saw that Ukraine lost many villages in Zaporizhia, some villages in the Dnipropetrovsk region, in Kharkiv, in Sumy. So it's not losing as at the very beginning of the war, but still losing. And I have the feeling that the past 2 weeks, it's been losing in a quicker path. Huh? So what's your opinion about the Ukrainian media? What can we say? They are not pro-Ukraine because they are showing these bad headlines. And the last question, how the data about the casualties were collected? Because I've seen, since the beginning of the war, I've seen many like reports showing very different results. Like some show that Russia has lost much more than Ukraine, others show the opposite, and I don't know if we can trust in this data. How I don't know how they were collected and if we can trust this. If it is possible to trust that in the middle of a war. I have the feeling that maybe the Ukrainian government and the Russian government, they don't know how many people they lost in this war. Like, I think even they can't count until now how much people they lost. But thank you very much for your lecture. It was very interesting.
Thank you. So let me first address this question about the data about casualties in an unsatisfying way. This is not my area of expertise. The Institute for the Study of War, the Russia program at the Harvard Kennedy School, and researchers on war in lots of countries in Europe and the United States have generally shown that Russia is losing more than Ukraine. How many more? Is it twice as many more? 3 times as many more? 50% more? I don't know. And their methods for estimating these are really estimates. As you say, maybe the Ukrainian government and Russian government don't even know how many casualties they have lost, but they both make lots of efforts to keep it a secret. And it's hard to tell how many people are actually serving in the Ukrainian military. In the Russian military, none of this data is easily accessible. So I look at multiple different estimates, and I see generally Russia's losing a lot more. Many of these estimates, I believe, are based on extrapolations from specific news reports where someone has seen people killed, where Ukrainian or injured Ukrainian soldiers. There's some journalists at the front, they report that this happened. They report Russian soldiers being injured or killed, Ukrainians coming upon Russian soldiers. And so they extrapolate with estimation methods where they try and estimate how intense was the fighting in this particular place, how does it compare to other places, other instances of battles over time. Indeed, I think casualty reports, because they are hard to see, they are hard to really know. It's difficult to determine from that who is winning or losing. Certainly, both sides are losing a lot of people. We know this. And indeed, this brings us then to your second question about Ukrainian headlines. They show the same. And when we look at actual land area, when we look at reports from satellites, where, again, many researchers that have spent their whole career estimating who is in charge, who are those people down on the ground, are they Russian or Ukrainian soldiers, they can tell much more clearly whether there are Russian soldiers, occupying this village or Ukrainian soldiers occupying this village. And indeed, you said the past 2 weeks, it seems like, more villages are being occupied. And maybe if we wait a couple of months and then we go back and we look at, the first half of November, we'll be able to get a sense, are Russian forces advancing more rapidly? It's possible that in a few months, we'll see something like this in Ukraine, right? But we haven't seen it yet. These villages that have been taken, if it's more recently, well, it's nothing like this yet. And indeed, are Ukrainian journalists, are they not pro-Ukraine? Well, I think what this shows, and your own example shows, that they are not so pro-Ukraine that they have jettisoned their journalistic standards and professional approach. They report the news. They report what happens, and the Ukrainian state has a free press that allows them to report it. If Russian journalists were trying to report the same thing in Russian news media, it wouldn't be happening. It's not happening. If there's opposition journalism in Russia, it's very much has to be kept in secret, and it's hardly able to report anything on the war. People who might be, kind of informal journalists for outlets like Medusa or something like this, they're not able to report any of this about the war. So what I would say is, not that Ukrainian journalists are not pro-Ukraine, but I think what this shows is the unintended consequences of a free press, of journalists who adhere to journalistic professional standards, that this can create the impression of losing. And it's indeed no surprise that the Ukrainian government tries to hide its casualty numbers because it does want to keep up morale. It does have a different priority than Ukrainian journalists, who are journalists first, and trying to help Ukraine win the war second. Obviously, Russian journalists, Russian military bloggers, most of them are trying to help Russia win the war first. If any of them is countervailing the Russian desired narrative, they're under a lot of threat and danger, and many of them, long before the war, have been murdered, killed, or driven out of Russia. So I think this idea of being pro-Ukraine, obviously, if you have professional standards for how your research or your journalism or whatever job you have should be practiced, unless you're actually fighting, then you may end up having a contradiction between the unintended consequences of your professionalism and what you hope will be the outcome of the war. Now, your first question about military versus political sort of estimation of who is winning the war, indeed, I think you are right that there is this if the war ended now, politically, Russia accomplished much less than it hoped, even at first. And it sort of hardened Ukraine against Russia in a way that was certainly not what Putin had hoped or is hoping today. If the war ended this way, would it be a military loss for the Ukrainians, though? It would. But the war is not ending, right? The war is not ending. And it didn't end when things were going worse for Ukraine at the beginning. And it didn't end when things were going the worst for Russia about a year or so into the war. And it's still not ending now that it looks like Ukraine is suffering more than Russia. Ukraine has not been knocked out of the war. They're not at this point. They're not going to end the war on these lines. If we see a big breakout of Russian forces, then all of a sudden we may see Ukraine deciding to surrender, to accept a ceasefire where they lose lots of territory, and then that's an even bigger military defeat for Ukraine and maybe an advantage for Russia if that happens. But it hasn't happened yet. It's a war of attrition, and we don't know as much about the Russian economy. We don't know lots of details about Russian manpower reserves. There is information that trickles out of Russia about budget deficits going up, oil revenues going down. Which country is willing to hold out longer? And Ukraine, since it's on its own territory where it's fighting, one might speculate that the Ukrainians are willing to hold out longer, even if they suffer more. Certainly, they've suffered a lot already. As you say, millions of people lost their houses. We haven't seen Russians in any significant numbers displaced, losing houses, losing schools. Ukrainians have already shown how much they're willing to suffer, and they haven't given up yet. If indeed Russians had to suffer something like this, well, they didn't give up in 1942. 80 years later, would things be different? Who knows? Maybe they would. I'm sure Ukraine, if it had the ability to break out and conquer lots of Russian territory, there's no indication that it has the kind of war goals that Nazi Germany did at the beginning of this war, of World War II. Certainly, Ukraine didn't invade Russia. Russia invaded Ukraine. We know that. One more sort of thing I think we should think about. You discussed military versus political kind of estimating. And I think estimating victory versus estimating current advantage are really different. Because as I said, the war is not ending. But I think domestic versus international is also a very important kind of distinction to draw. Putin, for all that Europeans seem to be scared of Russian drones flying over Poland or Estonia, or maybe even over Denmark, he has been shown that his military is much weaker than people thought. Now there's talk about having missiles that can travel 12,000 miles, and new kind of undersea weapons, but none of this has been proven. And really, the only facts that have been proven about the Russian military in the last 4 years are that it is much weaker and less capable, in terms of conventional warfare, of threatening its neighbors than was thought. And so in that sense, on the international stage, Putin has already lost face in a huge way. He's forced to become, in some ways, a kind of a vassal state of China or North Korea, this tiny, practically starving country on the other side of the Eurasian landmass. And so in international terms, it's even more surprising to me that we see this kind of trembling before Russia that we do in the American media. Of course, we cannot forget Russia's nuclear arsenal is obviously far more threatening than anything conventional that Russia can throw at its surrounding neighbors. So this is one reason that we still may be right to tremble in the United States. But then also, I think it's important to consider the domestic, international and domestic spheres. And indeed, it seems like Zelensky in Ukraine is doing better on the international stage, perhaps, than the domestic stage, where there's increasing squabbles. In Odessa, where I was, let's see, as I discussed, we have this statue of Pushkin. There are lots of statues of Pushkin being torn down all over Ukraine. And indeed, in a place like Odessa, which has a legacy that is very much connected to the Russian Empire and Russian language culture, we see big conflicts. The mayor of Odessa, who protested, had plans to take down statues of Pushkin and Isaac Babel. The mayor who was elected in Odessa protested against this, even as the governor of Odessa region, who's appointed by the presidential administration, was pushing for this de-Russification or decolonialization. And indeed, what's the result of it? Now the mayor of Odessa has been stripped of his Ukrainian citizenship based on suspicion that he also had dual Russian citizenship. It's not clear to me if this is true or not. Someone else probably knows more about it. But we can see that there are fractures on the domestic side in Ukraine. It doesn't look good. Ukraine looks much better to the international community, where indeed we have lots of international volunteers, both humanitarian and military, showing up in Ukraine. Ukraine has elicited lots of international cooperation, support, admiration. But on the domestic side, it's not so clear that things are going well for Ukraine. On the domestic side in Russia, it's a black box. We can't tell. Having lived in Bryansk, as last time I was giving this presentation, someone asked me, do you know people in Russia? What's really going on there? And I said, well, I had some students that became my social media friends, but There's no one that I'm still in touch with that I could really trust them to say what's really going on in Russia. Because all of these young people who are my students, if I see their social media contacts, they are just what the Putin regime wants them to say. This is what they are supporting. So on the domestic side in Russia, the international side is an enormous loss of face. The domestic side, we don't know. It's a black box.
Alguém mais gostaria de fazer pergunta? Pode ser em português.
Pode ser em português?
Eu vou fazer uma em português.
Ok, por favor.
Eu gostaria de explorar um pouco mais a dimensão trágica que aparece na imprensa norte-americana. Não apenas, né, pensar na amizade entre o Trump e o Putin, até que ponto essa amizade pode explicar, por exemplo, que a mídia seja a favor, que a mídia seja a favor ou que tenha uma abordagem favorável às vantagens russas. Eu queria entender um pouco melhor como é que essa relação entre a mídia noticiando as vantagens russas e a amizade entre o Trump e o Putin, de um lado. Será que é um apoio ao Trump ou é uma tendência da imprensa norte-americana a apoiar, talvez, o poder executivo? Não sei. Seria porque a guerra na Ucrânia é prejudicial também à economia? Você falou em medo, the fear of the nuclear weapons. Não sei até que ponto esse medo impregna também a apresentação de um quadro mais favorável à Rússia. E também gostaria de ouvir você um pouco mais sobre essa hipótese de que talvez mostrar a tragédia, as mortes de civis, a destruição das cidades, os ataques às centrais elétricas, às escolas, em que medida isso favorece a Rússia? Seria uma versão de not supporting the losers? Porque talvez mostrar a tragédia poderia ser uma vantagem para os ucranianos, mas pelo que você falou, é ambíguo. It's not as clear as it should be.
Okay.
Thank you.
So first of all, in terms of the American press maybe supporting the executive power or Trump, I think in general, that's not true at all. That it's, if anything, an unintended consequence rather than a desire to support the Russian side because people sympathize with, because someone in the press sympathizes with Trump. Indeed, if we look back, like I said, this really the most Trump sympathetic of these outlets here, Fox News, this is one place where we did see, Ukraine damaging Russia and this idea that Putin has dug himself a hole. So I don't think in the general American press there is a tendency to support Trump. Certainly not in the New York Times or CNN. It's possible maybe due to the ownership structure of the Washington Post, where Jeff Bezos, the Amazon billionaire, bought the Washington Post and seems to be more sympathetic to Trump, attending his fundraisers now. It's possible, but even when we see the most Trump sympathetic Fox News showing something that shows Ukraine damaging Russia, I don't think there is any conscious desire to support Russia because of a desire to support Trump. And I would say in the mainstream American media, there is no desire to support the executive. There is a consistent desire amongst journalists with high professional standards to criticize the executive, certainly as much or maybe even more when Trump is in the executive than when someone from the other party is the executive. But I would say this is not something that is characterizing the American media. And indeed, showing sympathy towards Ukraine is more broad and widespread, simply because, as you referenced in the second part, this is where we can see people suffering. This is where we can see human tragedy. But I do think certainly more as a cause of the rise of the politics of someone like Trump than as a result of Trump himself. I think this kind of support for winners, even if they are morally suspect, this has become more widespread in American society as kind of a response to a liberalism that has characterized, and in Europe too. Yeah. No, I think this kind of European liberal value, more and more Americans reject it. They want to see, they like to see people being arrested by ICE because it shows strength from the American state. They're not sympathetic to people who are suffering, whether they be in America or in Ukraine. I don't think that's predominant in America now, but I think over the last 20 years, it's advanced more. And maybe we are on a trajectory towards prizing machismo and strength, even ainda com brutalidade. E não se importa quem eticamente tem razão. Thank you.
Mas, please.
Good evening to everyone. Sorry, I was very, very late. However, then I have a question regarding this slide and regarding what you have said. Don't you think that, because I don't know, maybe you can clarify or elaborate on this. Don't you think that American media exaggerate what happens in the war? I mean, for sure, Russian media and Ukrainian media, they exaggerate the losses of the opposite party. For instance, yesterday, Ukrainian drones and even, as far as I understood, missiles attacked a port in Novorossiysk. And there were a lot of news in the Ukrainian media that the damage was really crucial. But today, the independent sources reported that there are already 2 tankers are getting oil there in that port of Novorossiysk. So it seems that very often media in Ukraine, as well as in Russia, they exaggerate the losses. What about American media? What do you think about it? I mean, can you elaborate on this? Thank you.
Yeah, I don't think American media is necessarily exaggerating losses. I think they are free to report the losses that Ukraine suffers, or much more free, and unable to report anything almost from the Russian side. As a result, it is Ukrainian losses that are reported, and about Russian losses, we have silence in the American media. And this creates an impression from the headlines, as my presentation was about, that Ukraine is suffering lots of really serious losses. And with no information about Russia, in relative terms, it seems like Ukraine is suffering more losses than Russia. Maybe that's true, but I think it's not due to a tendency to exaggerate losses, because I think most of the American media, or maybe not most, but certainly the outlets that my research focused on, the New York Times and the Washington Post, they have journalistic standards of wanting to really report as accurately as possible, rather than reporting on a slant. I did also look through some of the headlines that my research uncovered were connected not to, as we say, sort of straight journalistic reporting, but connected to editorials, really urging usually that America support Ukraine more, but in some cases urging Ukraine to accept an end to the war, even at a disadvantage. A few of these editorials, but in terms of suggesting which side was suffering more losses, the editorials, there were only about, I think, 7 or 8, and they didn't show a real difference between the editorials and the 80 total headlines.
Mais alguém? Well, thank you very much, Daniel.
Thank you. Muito obrigado pela oportunidade de apresentar as minhas estudos aqui em USP. É minha primeira vez aqui. Eu estou muito feliz e muito obrigado para todos quem vinham para a
Palestra.
sim, para minha palestra. Obrigado. Thank you.
Thank you.